over the city of Atlantis was a heavy and humid pressure that smelled of the salt spray, the hot bronze, and the ozone of a gathering storm. Kratos sat on the throne of the god of war, his breath a slow and rhythmic pulse that filled the silent halls of Olympus. He was haunted by the visions of his mortal past, the air in his spirit carrying the scent of the dry ash and the old blood of his family. The atmosphere around him was one of a quiet and sharp tension, as if the very marble of the palace was waiting for him to break the silence. He decided to seek the truth of his origins, the air in his lungs becoming a cold and steady flame as he looked toward the ocean where the city of the sea stood in the mist. He descended to the coast of Atlantis, the air there a violent and rhythmic gale that smelled of the deep water and the wet stone. The city was a massive and shimmering jewel of the bronze and the coral, but its air was one of a sudden and sharp terror. Kratos moved through the outer docks, the air whistling as the blades of Athena cut through the ranks of the aquatic guardians. Every strike was a rhythmic and sharp sound that echoed off the high sea walls, filling the air with the sparks and the scent of the brine. He felt the weight of the ocean pressing against the city, a constant and grounding force that made the air feel thick and carrying the metallic tang of the ancient machinery. He encountered the Scylla, a massive sea monster whose air was a suffocating pressure of the salt and the old rot. The beast rose from the depths with a rhythmic and deafening roar, its many tentacles turning the air into a chaotic storm of the white foam and the cold spray. Kratos fought with a brutal and focused speed, the air rushing past him as he avoided the snapping jaws of the monster. He used the environment of the docks to trap the creature, the air ringing with the sound of the heavy chains grinding against the stone. Every time the Scylla struck, the air was filled with the scent of the scorched bronze and the ozone. Kratos delivered a series of final and devastating blows, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the beast retreated into the dark water. He entered the heart of Atlantis, the air there stagnant and smelling of the old incense and the copper tang of the temple oil. He was searching for his mother, Callisto, the air in the hallways becoming a shallow and rhythmic vibration of the memories he had tried to bury. He found her in a quiet chamber where the air was a soft and rhythmic sigh that smelled of the dried lilies and the mountain pine. She spoke to him in a voice that was a low and steady whisper, her air one of a quiet and heavy sorrow. She told him that his brother Deimos was still alive and being held in the domain of the god of death. The air in the room turned hot and pressurized as she tried to reveal the name of his father, but her body began to twist and change under a rhythmic and terrifying curse. Callisto transformed into a massive and rhythmic beast of the fur and the claw, her air one of a sharp and hollow hunger that smelled of the sulfur and the old earth. Kratos was forced to fight the creature that had once been his mother, the air in the chamber filling with the sound of the clashing steel and the rhythmic groan of the stone floor. He moved with a relentless and cold energy the air whistling as he struck at the beast with a heart that was a leaden weight in his chest. He delivered the final blow. The air suddenly split by a flash of the green light as the monster turned back into the form of the woman. She died in his arms, the air around them a quiet and ringing silence that smelled of the salt and the finality. Kratos stood in the ruins of the chamber, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm as the fire of his rage turned into a cold and focused purpose. He knew that the gods had hidden the truth of his brother from him, and the air in his lungs was full of the strength to tear the heavens apart to find him. He moved toward the volcanic core of the city, the air there a thick and suffocating heat that smelled of the molten bronze and the sulfur. He encountered the Titan Thera, who was bound within the fires of the mountain. Her air was one of a quiet and heavy power that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. He used the blades to release her fire, the air suddenly turning into a blinding white-hot pressure that smelled of the ozone and the fresh ash. The first part of his journey ended as the release of the fire began to tear Atlantis apart. The air was a rhythmic and deafening roar of the explosions, and the steam as the city began to sink into the ocean. Kratos moved through the collapsing corridors, the air rushing past him as he fought his way toward the surface. The atmosphere was a chaotic mixture of the fire and the water, where the scent of the salt was replaced by the scent of the burning bronze. He reached the outer gates just as the city was swallowed by the waves. The air there a violent and cold gale that smelled of the absolute end. He stood on a fragment of the ruins, the air in his lungs a steady and focused rhythm as he looked toward the horizon. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the winter and the promise of a revenge that would take him to the domain of death. The path ahead was hidden by the mist and the spray of the falling city, but the Ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer a pawn. He looked toward the mountains of his home, and the air of Atlantis grew distant as he prepared to find his brother. The air in the mountain passes leading toward Sparta was a thin and freezing pressure that smelled of the ancient pine, the cold stone, and the distant scent of the wood smoke. Kratos moved with a slow and labored energy, the atmosphere around him carrying the weight of the grief from the sinking of Atlantis. The sound of the wind whistling through the jagged rocks was a rhythmic and hollow roar that made the very air in his chest feel like a heavy weight of lead. He reached the outskirts of his home city, where the air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the dried wheat and the salt of the Eurotas River. The atmosphere here was one of a quiet and rhythmic loyalty, as the citizens of Sparta looked at their god with a silent and deep reverence that filled the streets. He moved through the training grounds where the air was a constant and low vibration of the clashing bronze and the rhythmic shouting of the young warriors. Kratos felt the memories of his own youth pressing against the air, the scent of the sweat and the old iron carrying him back to the time before the blades and the blood of the gods. he encountered a group of his soldiers who looked at him with an air of a quiet and steady fire, their breath a shallow rhythm of the readiness. Kratos did not speak. The air in his spirit was a cold and focused pulse as he moved toward the temple of Ares. He knew that the gateway to the domain of death was hidden beneath the city, and the air of the temple was a stagnant and heavy stillness that smelled of the old incense and the copper tang of the sacrificial blood. Inside the temple, he encountered the ghost of a former life, the air becoming a shallow and trembling rhythm as he looked at the statues of the god he had replaced. The atmosphere was a chaotic and rhythmic swirl of the gray mist and the echoes of the screams of the past. Kratos used the fire of Thera to open the hidden vaults. The air suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as the stone floor began to grind open. He descended into the dark reaches of the mountain, the air there turning from the warmth of the sun to the cold and lightless pressure of the deep earth. He reached the jailer of Sparta, a creature of the shadow and the sharp iron, whose air was one of a sharp and hollow hunger that smelled of the rotting meat and the old bronze. The battle against the jailer was a roar of clashing steel and the rhythmic pulse of the dark magic. Kratos moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air rushing past him as he avoided the sweeping chains of the creature. The air in the cavern was filled with the scent of the scorched marble and the ozone. He used the blades of Athena to tear through the dark armor, the air filling with the rhythmic and sharp sound of the metal snapping. He delivered a series of final and devastating blows, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence as the jailer fell into the shadows. Kratos claimed the key to the domain of death, the air around the iron feeling cold and grounding against his skin. He continued his journey through the volcanic caves, where the air was a thick and suffocating heat that smelled of the sulfur and the molten rock. He encountered the spirits of the fallen Spartans, their air one of a quiet and rhythmic sorrow that smelled of the campfires and the mountain pine. They spoke of the honor of the city and the betrayal of the heavens, their voices a steady vibration in the quiet air. Kratos felt the fire of his rage turning the air in his heart into a cold and steady flame. He used the remaining energy of the mountain to bridge the gaps in the stone, the air whistling as the lava flowed in a rhythmic and glowing river beneath his feet. The atmosphere was a pressurized and violent gale of the heat and the smoke. He reached the edge of a massive underground chasm where the air was a freezing and violent gale that smelled of the deep earth and the ancient iron. This was the entrance to the domain of death, where the air was a thick and lightless mist that moved in slow and rhythmic swirls. He saw the massive gates of the underworld, their air one of a quiet and frozen authority that smelled of the funeral pyres and the dry dust. Kratos felt the weight of his task, a constant and grounding force that made his lungs feel like they were filled with the dry grit of the mountain. He checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the dark and prepared to enter the realm of Thanatos. The second part of his journey ended as Kratos stepped through the threshold of the dark, the air in his lungs a steady and focused rhythm. He saw the distant and flickering glow of the shadows, the air there a pale and shimmering gray that smelled of the poppies and the absolute sleep. He knew that his brother was close, but the air of the world was heavy with the scent of the traps the gods had set for him. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer running from his past. He entered the heart of the shadow, and the air of Sparta grew distant as he disappeared into the mist. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sulfur and the promise of a reunion that would burn the heavens. The path ahead was hidden by the black fog, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the cold energy of the winter. He was the man who would walk into the dark and pull the truth from the hands of the dead. The air in the domain of death was a thick and stagnant pressure that smelled of the dry bone, the old funeral pyres, and the freezing mist of the soulless void. Kratos moved through the gray corridors where the atmosphere felt heavy and lightless, as if the very breath of the living was forbidden in this place. The sound of the domain was a constant and low vibration, a rhythmic humming of the spirits that made the air in his chest feel like a leaden weight. He looked at the walls of the cavern, where the shadows moved in a slow and rhythmic crawl, carrying the scent of the damp soil and the ancient iron. Every step he took was a sharp and echoing thud that broke the silence of the grave, a rhythmic sound that signaled his arrival to the master of the dark. He encountered the Keres wraiths, creatures of the sharp claws, and the tattered spirit cloth, whose air was one of a sharp and hollow hunger. Kratos fought with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as the blades of Athena cut through the spectral forms with a rhythmic and sharp sound. The atmosphere in the narrow tunnels was a suffocating cold that smelled of the sulfur and the old rot. He used the fire of Thera to ignite the braziers of the dead, the air suddenly turning into a blinding white-hot pressure that pushed back the black fog. Every strike of his blades filled the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the struggle, a constant and grounding force against the weight of the underworld. He reached the temple of Thanatos, a structure of the black marble and the jagged obsidian that stood in the center of the abyss. The air around the temple was a sudden and intense stillness that smelled of the poppies and the absolute, dreamless sleep. Kratos moved through the grand entrance where the air was a rhythmic and deep vibration of the ancient magic. He saw the statues of the god of death, their air one of a quiet and frozen authority that smelled of the high clouds and the mountain mist. He had to navigate a series of rhythmic and complex puzzles involving the movement of the heavy stone cogs to align the bridges over the soul fire. The air in the vaults was stagnant and smelled of the old oil and the copper tang of the gears. Inside the inner sanctum, he found his brother Deimos, chained to a massive stone pillar. The air around the younger Spartan was a shallow and trembling rhythm that smelled of the sweat, the old blood, and the long years of the darkness. Deimos looked at Kratos with eyes that were a chaotic mixture of the gold and the blue light. His air, one of a sudden and sharp hatred that smelled of the betrayal and the old wounds. He spoke of the day the gods had taken him from the training grounds of Sparta. His voice, a low and steady vibration that made the air in Kratos' chest tremble. The air in the room turned hot and pressurized as the chains of the god of death began to glow with a rhythmic and dark energy. The reunion was not one of the peace, but of a violent and rhythmic explosion of the rage. Deimos, fueled by the years of the torture and the lies of the gods, attacked Kratos with a brutal and focused speed. The air was split by the sound of the clashing steel and the rhythmic groan of the stone floor. Kratos did not want to fight his brother, his air becoming a shallow and rhythmic pulse of the grief, but he was forced to defend himself against the onslaught. They moved across the chamber, the air a blur of the movement, and the sound that smelled of the iron and the dry dust. Every strike from Deimos was a rhythmic and sharp crash that shook the foundations of the temple, filling the air with the sparks and the scent of the old blood. The battle was interrupted by the arrival of Thanatos himself, the god of death, whose air was a massive and suffocating pressure that smelled of the lightning and the cold mountain mist. Thanatos mocked the brothers, his voice a rhythmic and deep thunder that filled the cavern. He spoke of the prophecy of the marked warrior and the trickery of the gods who had taken the wrong child. The air in the temple turned into a chaotic storm of the dark energy as Thanatos transformed into a massive and rhythmic beast of the shadow and the wing. He grabbed Deimos and flew toward the high cliffs of the suicide, the air rushing past in a continuous and rhythmic roar that felt like a mountain of wind. The third part of his journey ended as Kratos stood in the ruins of the sanctum, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet. He saw the path leading toward the heights of the domain. The air there, a thin and freezing gale that smelled of the high clouds and the salt spray. He knew that the final confrontation was close, and the air in his lungs was a steady pulse of the determination to save the only family he had left. He checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the heights, and prepared for the climb. The world was waiting for the sound of the god of death falling, and the air of the domain was full of the strength of the Spartan. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sulfur and the promise of a reunion that would end in the blood or the freedom. The path ahead was a mystery of the light and the shadow, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer alone. He entered the final ascent, and the air of the temple grew distant as he disappeared into the mist. The air on the suicide bluffs was a thin and freezing gale that smelled of the ancient stone, the dry lichen, and the sharp scent of the absolute void. Kratos climbed the jagged walls of the abyss, the atmosphere feeling heavy and carrying a pressure that tried to pull him back into the shadows. The sound of the wind whistling through the narrow cracks was a rhythmic and hollow moan that matched the steady thud of his own heart. He reached the high plateau where the ground was a dark and shimmering obsidian. The air there, a sudden and ringing silence that carried the scent of the gray ash and the old blood. He saw the massive figure of Thanatos standing at the edge of the world, his air one of a quiet and frozen authority that smelled of the funeral pyres and the cold iron. Deimos lay near the edge of the cliff, his breath a shallow and rhythmic vibration that smelled of the sweat and the long exhaustion. The air in Kratos' chest turned into a cold and steady flame as he saw the god of death prepare a final strike. He moved with a brutal and focused speed, the air rushing past him as he intercepted the blow with the blades of Athena. The atmosphere was suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar as the brothers stood together for the first time in an age. The air between the Spartans and the god was a physical wall of the fire and the ice, carrying the scent of the mountain pine and the sulfur of the deep pits. Every movement was a rhythmic and sharp sound that signaled the beginning of the end of the order of death. Thanatos laughed, a rhythmic and deep thunder that made the very air of the plateau tremble. He transformed into his true form, a massive and rhythmic beast of the black scales and the wings of the shadow. His air was a suffocating pressure that smelled of the ozone and the ancient rot of the grave. He struck at the brothers with a force that turned the air into a blinding and pressurized wall of the dark energy. Kratos and Deimos moved in a rhythmic and lethal harmony, the air whistling as they distracted the beast from two sides. Every strike from the blades was a sharp and echoing crash that shook the foundations of the bluffs, filling the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the struggle. The battle moved to the air, and the stone, the atmosphere a chaotic blur of the movement and the sound. Kratos used the fire of Thera to ignite his blades, the air turning hot and smelling of the scorched stone and the fresh ash. He leapt onto the back of the god, the air rushing past in a continuous and rhythmic roar that felt like a mountain of wind. He used the gauntlet of Zeus to deliver a series of rhythmic and heavy thuds to the divine armor, the air filling with the sound of the metal snapping and the rhythmic groan of the beast. The atmosphere was a pressurized and violent gale, where the scent of the salt from the distant sea was replaced by the scent of the divine ichor and the sulfur. Deimos used his spear and shield to provide a rhythmic and steady defense, the air ringing with the sound of the bronze against the claws of the god. The air in the chamber of the bluffs was a thick and stagnant heat that made their breath a shallow and rhythmic gasp. Kratos saw an opening and signaled to his brother, the air between them a silent and deep understanding that smelled of the training grounds of their youth. They delivered a combined strike to the heart of the beast. The air suddenly split by a flash of white-hot energy that smelled of the sun and the absolute power. Thanatos let out a rhythmic and massive roar of the pain, his body beginning to crumble into the gray dust and the shadows of the void. But the god of death was not yet silenced, and he struck out with a final and rhythmic desperation. He drove a massive shard of the obsidian through the chest of Deimos, the air suddenly turning into a quiet and ringing silence. Kratos felt the world stop, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and trembling rhythm as he saw his brother fall. The atmosphere was a chaotic and rhythmic swirl of the grief and the rage that smelled of the ozone and the old blood. He turned toward Thanatos, his air one of a sudden and terrifying fire that made the very stone beneath his boots crack. He moved with a speed that blurred the air, his every strike a rhythmic and deafening crash of the pure and unbridled hatred. The fourth part of his journey ended as Kratos stood over the shattered remains of the god of death, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet of the bluffs. The air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the absolute quiet and the cooling stone. He had killed the master of the dark, but the air of the world was heavy with the scent of the brother he had found only to lose again. He moved toward Deimos, the air there a soft and rhythmic sigh that carried the scent of the mountain flowers and the fresh rain. The prophecy was fulfilled, and the air of the domain was full of the strength of the one who had survived the gods. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the winter and the promise of a rest that was still a world away. The path ahead was hidden by the mist of the morning, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was the master of the death. He held his brother in the silence, and the air of the bluffs grew distant as he prepared for the final burial. The air on the high cliffs of the suicide bluffs was a heavy and mourning stillness that smelled of the cooling stone, the metallic tang of the god blood, and the distant, cold salt of the sea. Kratos stood over the body of his brother, his breath a slow and rhythmic pulse that filled the silent peaks of the underworld. The atmosphere around him was one of a profound and hollow grief, a pressure that felt more solid than the marble of the temples he had destroyed. He looked at the mark on Deimos, the red tattoo that had defined their lives, and the prophecy of the gods, the air in his spirit carrying the scent of the dry ash and the bitterness of a reunion cut short. The sky above the bluffs was a pale and shimmering gray, where the clouds moved in a slow drift over the land of the dead. He lifted the body of his brother with a brutal and steady gentleness, the air whistling a low note as he began the walk toward the grave digger who waited at the edge of the world. Every step Kratos took was a rhythmic and heavy thud that echoed off the jagged obsidian, a sound that signaled the finality of the Spartan line. The atmosphere of the domain was a sudden and strange peace, as if the death of Thanatos had left the air of the underworld a vast and open silence. He reached the freshly dug hole in the earth, the air there smelling of the damp soil and the ancient roots of the mountain. The grave digger looked at him with an air of a quiet and rhythmic knowing. his breath a shallow vibration in the still air. As Kratos laid Deimos into the earth, the air was a sudden and sharp pressure that smelled of the ozone and the divine judgment. He looked up to see the spirit of Athena and the golden light of Olympus flickering in the mist. Their air, one of a quiet and detached authority that smelled of the old incense and the mountain pine. They spoke of his worthiness and the fact that he was now ready to take his place as a true god among the immortals. Kratos felt the fire of his rage turning the air in his heart into a cold and steady flame. He realized that the gods had orchestrated every step of his suffering, the air in his lungs becoming a shallow and rhythmic pulse of a new and final hatred. He climbed the long stone path back toward the world of the living, the air rushing past him as he moved from the shadows of the dark back toward the light. He emerged onto the high bridge that led to the palace of the gods. The air there, a thin and freezing gale that smelled of the high clouds and the salt spray. He saw the doors of Olympus standing open, their air one of a quiet and frozen invitation that smelled of the burning cedar and the golden wine. Kratos moved with a relentless and cold energy, the air whistling as his blades clicked against the stone. The atmosphere was a pressurized and silent weight, where the scent of the home he had sought was replaced by the scent of the war he would bring to the heavens. He stood on the threshold of the godhood, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet of the heights. He looked down at the world of the mortals, where the smoke of the cities and the mist of the sea were beginning to turn into a gray and lifeless ash. He knew that he was the Ghost of Sparta, a man who had conquered the death, only to find that the life of a god was a cage of the gold and the lies. The air in the square was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of his own history. He accepted the status of the god of war, but the air in his spirit remained a cold and lightless void that no divine power could fill. The fifth part of his journey ended as Kratos sat upon his throne once more, the air in the hall a sudden and ringing silence that smelled of the absolute power and the absolute loneliness. He saw the visions of the future moving through the air like a pale and shimmering rain, carrying the scent of the coming storm. He checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the palace, and prepared for the age of the rage that was to come. The world was waiting for the sound of the first mountain falling, and the air of Olympus was full of the strength of the one who would never forgive. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the winter and the promise of a revenge that would burn the stars. The path ahead was a mystery of the light and the shadow, but the Ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was the master of his own destiny. He sat in the dark, and the air of the underworld grew distant as he prepared for the end of the gods. The air in the throne room of the god of war was a heavy and metallic stillness that smelled of the heated iron, the old blood, and the sharp ozone of a brewing storm. Kratos sat upon his high seat of stone, his breath a slow and rhythmic pulse that filled the vast and echoing hall. The atmosphere around him was one of a quiet and pressurized tension, as the other gods of Olympus watched from the shadows with an air of a sudden and sharp distrust. Kratos felt the divine power flowing through his limbs like a river of the liquid fire, but the air in his spirit remained a cold and lightless void that smelled of the funeral pyres of his brother. He looked down at the map of Greece spread across the marble floor. The air there carrying the scent of the dry dust and the coming war. He began to lead the Spartan army on a series of rhythmic and brutal campaigns across the lands of the mortals. The air in the cities turning into a chaotic storm of the smoke and the bitter salt. Every city that fell was a rhythmic and deafening roar of the crumbling stone and the clashing bronze, filling the air with the sparks and the iron scent of the struggle. Kratos moved through the battlefields like a shadow of the white ash, the air whistling as the blades of Athena cut through the ranks of those who dared to defy the will of Sparta. The atmosphere of the world was becoming a thick and suffocating heat that smelled of the friction and the divine rage. He was no longer just a servant of the mountain, but a force that was beginning to rewrite the air of the earth with the sound of the iron. The other gods began to whisper in the halls of the palace, their air one of a quiet and rhythmic judgment that smelled of the mountain mist and the old incense. Hermes and Helios looked at the new god of war with a sharp and hollow contempt. The air between them, a physical wall of the cold and steady fire. They saw the way the air of Greece was turning into a violent gale of the Spartan ambition, and they feared the strength of the one who had conquered the domain of death. Kratos ignored the warnings of the heavens, the air in his lungs, a steady and focused rhythm, as he pushed his armies further into the territories of the other gods. He used the power of the throne to summon the rhythmic and massive storms of the war, the air filling with the sound of the thunder and the scent of the ozone. He encountered a temple dedicated to Athena, where the air was a sudden and strange peace that smelled of the dried lilies and the ancient parchment. The goddess appeared as a shimmering green mist, her air one of a quiet and sharp urgency that made the very air in Kratos' chest tremble. She spoke of the balance of the world and the danger of the rage that was consuming the air of the mortals. Kratos met her gaze, the air between them a thick and stagnant pressure that smelled of the betrayal and the old wounds. He told her that the gods had taken everything from him, and that the air of the world would now belong to the ones who were strong enough to take it. He turned his back on the goddess, the air whistling as he walked back into the light of the fires. The campaigns reached the edge of the territories protected by the king of the gods himself, where the air was a thin and freezing gale that smelled of the lightning and the high clouds. Kratos stood on the cliffs overlooking the valley. The air, there a rhythmic and deep vibration of the coming clash. He saw the golden light of the Olympian guardians gathering in the mist, their air one of a quiet and frozen authority that smelled of the ozone and the ancient iron. Kratos felt a sense of absolute and quiet focus, The air in his heart was finally free of the doubt. He raised his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the heights, and signaled the final charge of the Spartan line. The atmosphere was a pressurized and violent storm where the scent of the salt was replaced by the scent of the fresh blood. The sixth part of his journey ended as the first bolts of the divine lightning began to strike the earth. The air suddenly split by a rhythmic and deafening roar. Kratos stood at the front of the assault, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet before the impact. He was the god of war, and the air of the world was waiting for the sound of the heavens breaking. He checked the grip on his blades, the skin feeling cool and grounding against the wind, and prepared to lead his people into the heart of the storm. The prophecy of the marked warrior was moving through the air like a pale and shimmering rain, and the air of the mountain was full of the strength of the one who would never bow again. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sulfur and the promise of a war that would reach the very gates of the palace. The path ahead was a mystery of the light and the shadow, but the Ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was the master of the battle. He stepped into the valley, and the air of the throne room grew distant as he prepared for the clash with the gods. The air on the high ridges overlooking the city of Rhodes was a thick and suffocating heat that smelled of the salt spray, the burning cedar, and the copper tang of the fresh blood. Kratos stood at the head of his Spartan army, his body a massive and rhythmic tower of the pale muscle, and the red tattoos that glowed with a divine light. The atmosphere was one of a sharp and electric tension, as the ground beneath his boots vibrated with the rhythmic marching of the thousands of the soldiers. Kratos felt the divine power of the god of war pulsing through his veins like a river of the liquid fire, a constant and grounding force that made the air in his chest feel like a pressurized wall. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was a bright and rhythmic pulse, the air there a pale and shimmering gold. He descended into the city like a falling star of the white ash, the air rushing past him in a continuous and rhythmic roar. The sound of his impact was a deafening and sharp crash that shattered the marble of the harbor, filling the air with the sparks and the scent of the scorched stone. He moved through the streets with a brutal and focused speed, the air whistling as the blades of Athena cut through the ranks of the Rhodesian defenders. Every strike was a rhythmic and heavy thud that echoed off the high bronze statues, a sound that signaled the beginning of his final act of the defiance. The atmosphere of the city was a chaotic storm of the smoke and the sea salt, where the air smelled of the iron and the coming end. Above the chaos, the sky was a rhythmic and dark swirl of the clouds, where the voice of Athena echoed like a low and steady thunder. She pleaded with Kratos to stop his path of the destruction, her air one of a quiet and rhythmic sorrow that smelled of the dried lilies and the mountain pine. She warned him that the patience of Olympus had reached its limit, and that the air of the world was turning against him. Kratos met the gaze of the heavens, the air in his spirit, a cold and steady flame of the hatred. He told the goddess that he owed nothing to the mountain, and that the heir of the world would now be written in the blood of those who had lied to him. He turned his blades toward the massive colossus of Rhodes, the air filling with a rhythmic and deafening roar. The final confrontation of his early reign was a roar of clashing steel and the rhythmic pulse of the divine energy. Kratos used his size and his strength to tear through the foundations of the city, the air ringing with the sound of the heavy chains grinding against the bronze. He felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him, but he moved with the steady rhythm of a man who was no longer a pawn. The atmosphere was a pressurized and violent gale, where the scent of the salt was replaced by the scent of the ozone and the fresh ash. He was the ghost of Sparta, a god who had conquered the death and the fates, and the heir of the world was now a monument to his relentless will. The final part of this journey ended as a white bird descended from the golden clouds. Its air, one of a quiet and rhythmic judgment that smelled of the lightning and the cold mist. Kratos felt his divine power being drained into the bronze giant, the air around his skin turning into a cold and lightless void. He looked up at the sky, where the golden light of Zeus was beginning to flicker in the mist, and he knew that the great betrayal had finally begun. The air in the square was stagnant and smelled of the old dust and the copper tang of his own history. He stood on the broken bridge, his breath a steady and heavy rhythm in the quiet, and prepared to face the father who had sent him to the dark. The saga of the brother and the sea was over, and the air of the world was full of the coming storm. Kratos took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of the sulfur and the promise of a revenge that would reach the very heart of the mountain. He checked the grip on his blades, the metal clicking in the silence of the ruins, and prepared for the war that would end the age of the gods. The path ahead was a mystery of the light and the shadow, but the ghost of Sparta moved with the steady rhythm of a man who would never be silenced.